March 23, 1945. Dawn breaks cold over the Rhine River near Rhine. The air smells of diesel fuel and wet earth. A German Oberst stands in the ruins of a stone farmhouse, binoculars pressed to his face. His hands tremble, not from the cold, but from what he sees. Quotes. Across the river, stretching back toward the horizon, is a column of American trucks. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. They move in a steady, unbroken line, headlights cutting through the morning mist. Each one carries crates of ammunition, barrels of fuel, rations, medical supplies, spare parts. The sound is a low mechanical thunder that doesn't stop. He lowers the binoculars. Behind him, a young lieutenant waits for orders. The Oberst says nothing. There are no orders left to give. He has fought since Poland, survived Stalingrad, retreated through France. But this is something else, Tyres. He says some more. This is not an army. This is a machine. And it runs on a supply line that begins somewhere he cannot imagine and ends here, at the heart of the Reich. He thinks of the trains that no longer run, the fuel depots that burned weeks ago, the hungry men in his command eating sawdust bread. And then he looks again at the endless American column, rolling forward like a river of steel and rubber, fed by a country an ocean away. For the first time, he understands. Germany has not lost a battle. It has lost a war of mathematics. On December 7, 1941, the United States was not ready for war. Its standing army ranked 17th in the world, smaller than Romania's. Its factories produced cars and refrigerators, not tanks and bombers. Its military logistics system was a patchwork of regional depots, outdated railroads, and peacetime thinking. But within hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor, something profound began to shift. Not just in policy or strategy, but in the very infrastructure of the nation itself. America had been preparing quietly for 2 years. The Lend-Lease Act of March 1941 had already begun transforming production lines. Factories in Detroit retooled to build aircraft engines. Steel mills in Pittsburgh ran around the clock. But now, with war declared, the scale expanded beyond anything the world had ever seen. President Roosevelt called for 50,000 aircraft a year. Military planners knew that number was impossible. They built 60,000, then 96,000. By 1944, American factories were producing more war material than Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. But production was only half the equation. The other half was delivery. And delivery meant logistics. The unglamorous, mathematically brutal science of moving millions of tons of supplies across thousands of miles, through submarines and storms and chaos, to the men who needed them. Without logistics, tanks were sculptures, aircraft were ornaments, armies starved in place. The man tasked with solving this problem was Lieutenant General Brehen B. Somerville, commander of the Army Service Forces, a West Point engineer with a mind for systems and zero tolerance for inefficiency. Somerville understood what many combat generals did not. Wars were won in warehouses, not just on battlefields. He reorganized the entire supply chain from the ground up. How? He created a network of ports of embarkation on both coasts. He built new depots inland, massive complexes in places like Kansas and Pennsylvania, where goods could be sorted, packaged, and shipped with industrial precision. Somerville's vision was radical. He wanted standardization. Every American division, whether in Europe or the Pacific, would receive the same supplies and the same packaging on the same schedule. This eliminated guesswork. It allowed planners to calculate needs months in advance. It meant a tank in France and a tank in the Philippines used the same parts, burned the same fuel, fired the same ammunition. If one broke down, you didn't need a specialist, you needed a catalogue and a wrench. The system began with raw materials: wheat from Kansas, steel from Pennsylvania, rubber synthesized in Texas after Japanese forces cut off natural supplies from Southeast Asia, oil from wells in Oklahoma and California, cotton from the South, copper from Montana, fauna. Fine. These materials flowed to factories where they became rations, uniforms, bullets, shells, vehicles, and medicine. Then they flowed to staging areas, enormous depots where everything was counted, crated, and loaded onto trains. The trains moved to ports: New York, Boston, New York, Boston, Norfolk, Baltimore, New Orleans, Charleston. At these ports, longshoremen worked in shifts that never ended. They loaded Liberty ships, mass-produced cargo vessels that could be built in 6 weeks and carried 10,000 tons of supplies. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards launched over 2,700 Liberty ships. They were slow, ugly, and utilitarian. They were also the arteries of victory. The ships crossed the Atlantic in convoys, protected by destroyers and aircraft. German U-boats prowled the deep. Thousands of sailors died in cold water, their ships torn apart by torpedoes. But the convoys kept coming. For every ship sunk, 3 more launched. The mathematics favored America. Germany could not sink vessels faster than American yards could build them. On the other side of the ocean, in Britain and North Africa and later France, the supplies arrived at forward depots. These were tent cities of material, mountains of crates stacked under camouflage netting, guarded by military police, inventoried by clerks with typewriters and carbon paper. From these depots, the supplies moved again, this time by truck. The truck became the symbol of American logistics. The GMC CCKW, known as the Jimmy, was a 2.5-ton workhorse that could handle mud, snow, and shattered roads. It wasn't fast, it wasn't glamorous, but it was reliable, and there were hundreds of thousands of them. Drivers ran 24-hour routes, headlights taped over to thin slits, moving fuel and ammunition to the front lines while German artillery searched for them in the dark. This system, factory to train to port to ship to depot to truck to foxhole, was not improvised. It was designed. And it was designed to do one thing: sustain an army far from home indefinitely without pause. By the summer of 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy had succeeded, but the victory came with a logistical crisis no one had fully anticipated. The beaches were secure, the hedgerows were being cleared, inch by bloody inch. But the armies were moving faster than the supply lines could follow. Cherbourg, the major port the Allies had counted on, was a ruin. German engineers had demolished the docks, sunk ships in the harbour, and mined every crane and warehouse before retreating. It would take weeks to make it functional again. In the meantime, everything had to come across the beaches. Supplies were offloaded from ships onto smaller landing craft, then driven up temporary roads made of steel matting laid over sand. Storms delayed shipments, tides ruined schedules, fuel sat in drums on the shore while Patton's tanks, 50 miles inland, ran dry. Ammunition piled up in Normandy while infantry units rationed bullets. The system was choking on its own success. The solution came in the form of the Red Ball Express, a convoy system that would become legendary. Named after the railroad term for high-priority freight, the Red Ball Express was a dedicated truck route that ran from the beaches to the front lines, bypassing everything else. The roads were marked with red balls painted on signs. No civilian traffic, no military traffic, except supply trucks. The convoys rolled day and night, drivers pushing past exhaustion, delivering 6,000 tons of supplies every 24 hours at the program's peak. The majority of the Red Ball drivers were black soldiers, men assigned to segregated quartermaster and transportation units. They were not supposed to be heroes. The U.S. Army in 1944 was still deeply segregated, and black troops were largely kept out of combat roles, relegated to support duties that white officers considered less important. But in the chaos of the summer of 1944, those support duties became the difference between advance and collapse, The drivers of the Red Ball Express worked grueling shifts, often 36 hours straight, navigating damaged roads, dodging German stragglers, and keeping the Third Army moving east. They drove without sleep. They drove through ambushes. When trucks broke down, they cannibalized parts from other vehicles and kept going. Some drivers were killed by snipers. Others died when their trucks, overloaded with volatile fuel or ammunition, caught fire or exploded. But the convoys didn't stop. Between August and November 1944, the Red Ball Express moved over 400,000 tons of supplies. It was improvised, desperate, and brilliant. Behind the convoys, the larger system continued to expand. Engineers built fuel pipelines across France, buried tubes that carried gasoline directly from the coast to forward depots. By early 1945, the Big Inch and Little Inch pipelines were delivering millions of gallons a day, eliminating the need for thousands of truck trips. Trains followed as Allied engineers repaired bombed rail lines and converted them to carry American rolling stock. Every mile of rail restored saved dozens of trucks for other duties. The ports finally came online. Antwerp, captured in September 1944, became the lifeline of the northern armies once the Scheldt estuary was cleared of German forces. Marseille in the south handled supply for the 7th Army. By early 1945, these ports were unloading 50,000 tons of cargo daily. The ships arrived on schedule. The cranes never stopped. The depots emptied and filled again. Back in the United States, the logistics network operated with the precision of a factory floor. The Port of New York alone processed over 3 million tons of war material every month. Convoys of freight trains arrived from the Midwest, loaded with crates marked for specific divisions in specific theaters. Clerks with carbon paper tracked every item. Dock workers loaded them onto ships. The ships sailed on timetables calculated to the hour. This was not the work of a few generals or a single brilliant plan. It was the work of hundreds of thousands of people, most of whose names are lost. Longshoremen in Brooklyn, welders in Pittsburgh, farmers in Iowa who grew the wheat that became hardtack and biscuits. Women in munitions plants in Indiana who packed shells into crates. Railroad engineers who kept the trains running through blizzards. Civilian truck drivers who hauled goods to ports. Typists who kept the records. Cooks who fed the workers. And on the other side of the ocean, the German war machine watched all of this with growing disbelief. Their own logistics were collapsing. Fuel shortages crippled panzer divisions. Ammunition was rationed. Rations were cut. Horses pulled artillery because there was no diesel. Trains were bombed faster than they could be repaired. Factories in the Ruhr ran on slave labor and desperation. By late 1944, Germany was fighting with what it had, knowing no reinforcements were coming. America, by contrast, was fighting with an open tap. The supply line stretched from Kansas to the Rhine, and it never ran dry. Angle 1. The human angle. The men who drove the line, Private First Class James Rookard, sat behind the wheel of his GMC Jimmy at 300 hours, somewhere between Saint-Lô and Chartres. His eyes burned, his hands ached. The convoy had been rolling for 18 hours. Behind him, 39 other trucks followed in a line, headlights covered, invisible in the dark. Each carried 5 tons of 105 artillery shells. If one truck hit a mine or took fire, the whole column could go up. Rookard was 22 years old, from Philadelphia, and assigned to the 3,407th Quartermaster Truck Company. His unit was part of the Red Ball Express, and nearly every man in it was black. They had not been trained for combat. They had been trained to drive. But here on these roads, the distinction was meaningless. German artillery fell on supply routes just as it fell on infantry. Snipers hid in tree lines. Luftwaffe fighters, when they still flew, strafed anything that moved. The drivers had no armor. No weapons except rifles they barely had time to clean. No backup if something went wrong. They just drove. 36-hour shifts were common. 48-hour shifts happened. Men fell asleep at the wheel and woke up in ditches. Others didn't wake up. Rookard had seen a truck roll off an embankment outside of Ranches, the driver unconscious from exhaustion. The truck burned for hours. No one stopped, but they kept moving because they understood something most people didn't. The tanks at the front, the artillery batteries, the infantry, none of them moved without fuel and shells didn't teleport. They came on trucks, driven by men who would never get medals, never be written about in dispatches, never be photographed for Life magazine. And men whose job was to be invisible and indispensable at the same time. Rookard had joined the army because he wanted to fight. Instead, he was given a steering wheel. At first, he resented it. But after 3 months on the Red Ball, he understood. This was fighting, just a different kind. Eesh. Angle 2. The industrial angle. The Forge of Victory, Detroit, Michigan. January 1943. The Chrysler tank arsenal in Warren ran 24 hours a day, 3 shifts of workers building M4 Sherman tanks on an assembly line that looked like it came from a science fiction novel. Women in coveralls welded turret seams. Men in goggles bolted tracks. Every 20 minutes, a completed Sherman rolled off the line, painted olive drab, engine tested, ready to be loaded onto a rail car and sent east. The scale was incomprehensible. Before the war, Chrysler made cars. Now it made war machines, and it made them faster than any army could destroy them. By the end of 1943, American factories were producing a Sherman tank every 45 minutes, a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes, a Liberty ship every day and a half. The numbers didn't make sense until you saw the factories, vast cathedrals of steel and noise, lit by welding sparks, filled with the sound of hammers and rivets and engines roaring to life. This was the arsenal of democracy, and it worked because America had something no other nation in the war possessed: untouched infrastructure. German factories were bombed daily. Soviet factories had been relocated east of the Urals, rebuilt in freezing warehouses with workers half-starved. Japanese industry struggled under blockade and bombing. British factories worked miracles, but they were small and resource-starved. American factories had electricity, raw materials, railroads, and a workforce that had been unemployed for a decade and was now working overtime. The Great Depression had left millions desperate for work. The war gave them work. And they didn't just work. They exceeded every quota, every projection, every plan. Pittsburgh steel mills produced more tonnage in 1943 than the entire German steel industry. Texas refineries synthesized rubber after Japanese forces captured the natural rubber plantations of Southeast Asia. Kansas wheat fields fed not just American soldiers, but British and Soviet ones too. The Midwest became the breadbasket of the Allied war effort. Iowa corn fed soldiers in Africa. Nebraska beef fed soldiers in Italy. Oklahoma oil fueled tanks in France. This wasn't just production. It was overproduction. America made so much material that by 1945, supply depots in Europe were overflowing. Warehouses were full. Shells were stacked in open fields under tarps because there was nowhere else to put them. Patton's Third Army could fire artillery without worrying about running out. Infantry could use grenades liberally. Medics had morphine, sulfur powder, and plasma in abundance. Cooks served hot meals daily. Germany, by contrast, was eating its reserves. Japan was starving, and America was throwing away surplus rations because they were approaching expiration dates. Angle 3, the tactical angle. How supply dictated strategy. General George S. Patton was not known for patience. But in late August 1944, his Third Army sat motionless outside Metz, and Patton was furious. Not at the Germans, at logistics. His tanks had raced across France faster than anyone predicted. They had broken out of Normandy, swept through Brittany, crossed the Seine and pushed toward the German border. But now they sat silent, engines cold, waiting, not because of enemy resistance, because they had no fuel. The supply line had stretched too far, too fast. The Red Ball Express was running at maximum capacity, but even that wasn't enough. Patton needed 800,000 gallons of fuel a day to keep his tanks moving. He was getting a third of that. His ammunition stocks were low. His trucks were breaking down from overuse. His men were eating cold rations because there was no fuel to cook hot ones. Meanwhile, to the north, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group was receiving priority supply for Operation Market Garden, the airborne assault into the Netherlands. Eisenhower had made the call. Montgomery's offensive took precedence. Patton's advance would wait. Patton raged. He threatened. He pleaded. But the mathematics were unyielding. There were only so many trucks, so many gallons, so many shells. You could not sustain two major offensives simultaneously. Not with the port still limited. Not with the Red Ball running at breaking point. Strategy became a function of logistics. You could not attack where you wanted. You attacked where you could supply. This was the hidden war. The war of ton miles and fuel consumption rates and turnaround times. Patton understood it even if he hated it. So did Eisenhower. So did every corps and division commander who had to plan operations around supply schedules rather than enemy dispositions. The Germans, by contrast, no longer had that luxury. They didn't plan around supply. They fought with what they had and prayed for more. Angle 4, the German perspective. The mathematics of defeat. General Major Fritz Bayerlein had commanded the Panzerlehr Division since D-Day. It had been one of the most elite armoured formations in the Wehrmacht, trained for years, equipped with the best tanks Germany could produce. By September 1944, it barely existed. Not because of combat losses alone, but because of something Bayerlein had never experienced in Poland, France or Russia, the complete collapse of supply. His tanks sat immobile, empty fuel tanks like iron coffins. His artillery had ammunition for 3 days of fighting, maybe 4 if rationed carefully. His infantry ate once a day, bread made from sawdust and potatoes when they ate at all. Replacement parts didn't arrive. Reinforcements didn't arrive. Medical supplies ran out weeks ago. Wounded men died from infections that penicillin could have cured, but there was no penicillin. And across the line, the Americans seemed to have everything. Wehrmacht watched through binoculars as American trucks rolled endlessly forward. He listened to the sound of their artillery, firing barrages that lasted hours, thousands of shells expended without hesitation. He saw American soldiers eating hot food, smoking American cigarettes, wearing clean uniforms. It wasn't courage or tactics that separated the two armies anymore. It was supply. Wehrmacht had fought the British in North Africa, where both sides scraped for every gallon of fuel, every shell, every ration. That was a fair fight. This was not. This was industrial annihilation. The Americans didn't need to outfight you. They just need to outlast you. They just needed to outlast you. And they could outlast anyone. German officers who had survived the Eastern Front spoke of Soviet human wave attacks, the sheer mass of men and tanks thrown into battle without regard for losses. This was different. The Americans didn't waste men. They wasted material. Or fire. If a tank was damaged, they abandoned it and called for another. If a truck broke down, they pushed it off the road and moved on. They had so much that loss didn't matter. Wehrmacht had been told back in 1940 that America was soft, that its soldiers were factory workers and farmers who would break under pressure, that its industry was designed for cars, not war. He had believed it once. Now, sitting in a headquarters with no electricity, no fuel, and no hope, he understood the truth. America had turned its factories into weapons more powerful than any panzer, and those weapons were destroying Germany without ever crossing the ocean. One of his staff officers, a captain who had studied engineering before the war, tried to explain it in numbers. America produced more steel in a month than Germany did in 6, more oil in a week than Germany's reserves for a year, more trucks in a quarter than Germany had built in the entire war. The numbers were absurd. They couldn't be real. But the evidence was rolling past his position every day, an endless convoy of American trucks carrying American supplies to American soldiers who would never run out. Wehrmacht wrote in his diary that night, September 14, 1944, "We are not fighting an army, we are fighting a factory." A factory, and you cannot kill a factory with bullets. Angle 5, the technological angle, standardization as a weapon before the war. Military logistics was an art of improvisation. Different units used different equipment. Different nations used incompatible parts. A Soviet truck couldn't use American tires. Repair was a nightmare of custom fabrication and hope. America changed that. Standardization became doctrine. Every Jeep used the same spark plugs. Every truck used the same tires. Every tank used the same ammunition. This wasn't glamorous. It didn't win headlines, but it won the war. Consider the Mohn Garand rifle. Every American infantryman carried one. It fired .46 ammunition, the same cartridge used in the 1919 machine gun and the M1903 Springfield. That meant one type of ammunition fed 3 weapons. So, supply clerks didn't need to track separate inventories. Soldiers could share ammo in a firefight. Logistics became simpler by an order of magnitude. The same principle applied to vehicles. The GMC Jimmy truck used a 6-cylinder engine with interchangeable parts. If an engine failed, a mechanic didn't need specialized tools or custom replacements. He needed a wrench and a parts catalogue. Repair times dropped from days to hours. Availability rates soared. Compare that to German logistics. The Wehrmacht used over 2,000 different vehicle types during the war, from captured French trucks to Czech tanks to Italian artillery tractors. Each one required different parts, different tools, different expertise. A repair depot needed warehouses full of components, most of which would never be used. When a vehicle broke down, it often stayed broken because the right part didn't exist or couldn't be found. American engineers also pioneered modular design. Engines, transmissions, and axles were built in separate factories and assembled at the end. If one factory was bombed or production lagged, another could compensate. The system had redundancy built in. Germany had bottlenecks. One bombed ball-bearing plant in Schweinfurt crippled tank production for months. Then there was fuel. American forces used 80-octane gasoline for trucks and vehicles and 100-octane aviation fuel for aircraft. 2 types. German forces used a dozen different fuel grades, from diesel for U-boats to synthetic fuels for the Luftwaffe, each requiring separate supply chains. Simplicity was a force multiplier. The ultimate expression of this philosophy was the Liberty ship. Everyone was identical, built from the same blueprints, using the same prefabricated sections, welded together in the same sequence. If a ship was torpedoed, another took its place within weeks. Crew training was universal. Repair was straightforward. It was boring, utilitarian engineering. It was also devastatingly effective. By 1945, the US Army could replace a destroyed tank in 48 hours. Germany took months, if at all. The technological advantage wasn't in superior weapons. It was in the ability to deliver, repair, and replace those weapons faster than the enemy could destroy them. Angle 6, the moral angle. The psychology of abundance there is a moment in every soldier's life when he realizes he is not going to die of starvation or thirst or neglect. When he understands that the system behind him will feed him, clothe him, arm him, and if he is wounded, save him, that moment changes everything. American soldiers in Europe knew that moment. They ate 3 meals a day, even on the front lines. Hot coffee in the morning, canned meat and bread for lunch, a hot meal at night if the field kitchens could reach them. Cigarettes were issued regularly. A mail arrived from home. Medical care was immediate. Aid stations within minutes. Field hospitals within hours. Full surgical units within a day. German soldiers knew the opposite. They ate when food was available, which was rarely. They went days without resupply. They watched their wounded die because there were no medics, no morphine, no ambulances. They smoked cigarettes made from sawdust and dried leaves. They received no mail because the postal system had collapsed. They fought because they had no choice, not because they believed in victory. Morale is not an abstract concept. It is a function of supply. A soldier with a full stomach and dry socks fights harder than a soldier who is starving and frozen. A soldier who believes his nation can sustain him will take risks. A soldier who believes he is abandoned will surrender. By early 1945, German units were surrendering en masse, not because they were cowards, but because they were hungry. American POW camps offered regular meals. That was enough. Tens of thousands of German soldiers walked into captivity voluntarily, hands raised, asking for food. Some American officers reported that captured Germans wept when given rations, not from shame but from relief. This was the moral dimension of logistics. Abundance bred confidence. Scarcity bred despair. And America had abundance in quantities that defied comprehension. March 7, 1945. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen still stood. This should have been impossible. German engineers had wired every bridge across the Rhine for demolition. Orders from Berlin were explicit. Destroy every crossing, leave nothing for the Americans. But at Remagen something went wrong. The charges failed. The bridge stood, and at 15:57 hours, men of the 9th Armoured Division's 27th Armoured Infantry Battalion started across. They ran. German machine guns fired from the far bank. Shells burst on the bridge deck. The steel groaned under their boots. But they made it. By nightfall, the first American forces were on the eastern side of the Rhine. Hitler, when he heard the news, ordered the immediate execution of the officers responsible for failing to destroy the bridge. It didn't matter. The breach was open. What happened next was not a battle. It was a logistical avalanche. Within 24 hours, engineers were reinforcing the Ludendorff Bridge and building pontoon crossings upstream and downstream. Within 48 hours, trucks were rolling across in convoys. Within 72 hours, tanks followed. The bridgehead at Remagen became a funnel through which an entire army poured. And behind that army came the supply line, stretching back across France, across the Atlantic, back to ports and railheads and factories in a nation an ocean away. German commanders on the eastern bank watched this with a kind of stunned paralysis. They had no reserves to counterattack. No fuel to move what reserves existed. No ammunition for sustained artillery fire. The Luftwaffe was grounded. The Wehrmacht was fighting on fumes and desperation. And across the river came an American force that seemed to have no logistical constraints whatsoever. By mid-March, the Americans had 6 divisions across the Rhine at Remagen. By the end of March, Patton's Third Army had crossed farther south near Oppenheim against minimal resistance. Montgomery crossed in the north with the full weight of the British and Canadian armies. The Rhine, the last natural barrier protecting Germany, was breached in 3 places, and the supply system didn't falter. Fuel pipelines were extended across the river within days. Engineers laid temporary rail lines. Truck convoys ran 24 hours without pause. Depots were established on the eastern bank, vast tent cities of ammunition and rations and spare parts. The system that had been built over 3 years, refined through North Africa and Italy and France, now operated with terrifying efficiency. A Wehrmacht logistics officer, captured near Rhine in late March, was interrogated by American intelligence. The transcript survives. He was asked how Germany planned to stop the Allied advance. He laughed, not from defiance but from exhaustion. "Stop you," he said. "We have no fuel for our tanks. Or, sir, we have no shells for our guns. Our men eat grass. You ask how we stop you? We cannot stop ourselves from starving." He was then asked what surprised him most about the American army. He didn't hesitate. The trucks. Always the trucks. Always the trucks. They never stop. We destroy a bridge, and you build another. We blow a road, and you drive around it. We ambush a convoy, and 3 more convoys arrive. Where do the trucks come from? How many do you have? It is as if your entire nation is a factory that produces only trucks and gasoline. The interrogator noted in his report that the German officer seemed less like a prisoner of war and more like a man who had witnessed something beyond his comprehension. He was not angry. He was not angry. He was not defiant. He was simply tired of fighting an enemy that could not be exhausted. By April, American and British forces were racing across Germany. Not advancing, racing. Patton's Third Army covered 50 miles in 3 days. The First Army reached the Elbe River by mid-April. The Ninth Army drove toward Hamburg. These were not grinding advances measured in yards and casualties. These were pursuit operations, mechanized columns chasing a collapsing enemy. And every mile of that advance was sustained by supply. Fuel trucks followed the tanks. Ammunition trucks followed the artillery. Medical trucks followed the wounded. The system never broke. It bent under strain, improvised when necessary, but it never stopped functioning. Contrast this with the German retreat. Wehrmacht units fled east, abandoning equipment because there was no fuel to move it. Entire divisions dissolved as soldiers deserted or surrendered. Supply depots were overrun before they could be evacuated or destroyed. German civilians watched as their army, once the most powerful in Europe, disintegrated into a rabble of starving, exhausted men walking home because there were no trains, no trucks. On April 11, 1945, American forces reached the Elbe River and stopped, not because of German resistance, because Eisenhower had agreed with Soviet commanders that the Elbe would be the demarcation line. Berlin would be taken by the Red Army. The Americans held their positions and waited, but the supply line didn't stop. It continued to build. Depots filled beyond capacity. Ammunition piles grew so large they were visible from the air. Fuel reserves reached levels sufficient to sustain operations for months. The American army, at the moment of its greatest triumph, was better supplied than at any point in the war. German officers who surrendered in those final weeks all said the same thing. They had not been defeated by superior tactics or courage. They had been defeated by mathematics. By an enemy that could replace every loss, repair every breakdown, and feed every soldier without pause, without limit, without end. One Oberst, captured near Leipzig, was given a hot meal and coffee by his American captors. He ate slowly, savoring it. When asked if he had any questions, he looked at the American captain and said, "How does a country become so rich that it can feed even its enemies?" The captain had no answer. He just refilled the man's coffee cup. April 24, 1945. American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River near Torgau. Soldiers from 2 armies embraced, shared cigarettes and vodka, posed for photographs. The world celebrated. But for the logistics officers on both sides, the meeting revealed something profound and unsettling. The Americans arrived in columns of trucks, each one loaded, fueled, and ready to continue. Their uniforms were clean. Their equipment was new. They had field kitchens serving hot food. They had medical supplies in abundance. They had spare parts, spare tires, spare everything. One Soviet officer later wrote that the American encampment looked less like a military force and more like a traveling city, complete with electricity generators, portable showers, and even a mobile cinema showing films to the troops. The Soviets arrived on foot, on horseback, and in a ragtag collection of vehicles that included American Lend-Lease trucks, captured German vehicles, and tractors pulled from collective farms. Their soldiers were hard, lean, exhausted. They had fought from Stalingrad to Berlin, across 2,000 miles of devastation. They had done it with courage and blood, and a tolerance for suffering that bordered on the inhuman. But they had done it on the edge of logistical collapse. When American soldiers offered rations, the Soviets accepted with visible relief. When they saw the American supply depots, some laughed. Others grew quiet. The scale was incomprehensible. An American division consumed 700 tons of supplies per day. A Soviet division consumed a fraction of that, not by choice but by necessity. The Americans wasted more food in a week than some Soviet units received in a month. This was not a criticism of Soviet logistics. The Red Army had performed miracles, rebuilding its supply system while fighting the most brutal war in human history. But it was a revelation of what American industry had achieved. The gap wasn't tactical, it was existential. America had fought a two-front war across two oceans and had done so with a logistical surplus that defied belief. As in the Reich, the final days unfolded with the inevitability of a collapsing structure. German units disintegrated. Berlin fell on May 2. Hitler was already dead. Admiral Dönitz, named as Hitler's successor, attempted to negotiate selective surrenders in the West while continuing to fight in the East, hoping to save as many Germans as possible from Soviet captivity. Eisenhower rejected the proposal. Surrender would be unconditional and total. On May 7, 1945, at 241 hours, General Alfred Jodl signed the instrument of unconditional surrender at Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims, France. The war in Europe was over. The fighting stopped, but the supply system did not. In the weeks following V-Day, American logistics shifted from sustaining combat operations to occupying and administering a shattered continent. Millions of displaced persons needed food, shelter, and medical care. German prisoners of war needed to be fed and processed. Cities needed rebuilding. Infrastructure needed repair. And the American supply system, built to sustain armies in battle, now sustained the peace. Field kitchens that had served soldiers now served refugees. Medical units that had treated combat wounds now treated disease and malnutrition. Supply depots that had distributed ammunition now distributed blankets, medicine, and food. The trucks that had carried shells to the front now carried supplies to orphanages, hospitals, and displaced persons' camps. This was not generosity born from idealism, it was pragmatism. Eisenhower and his staff understood that a starving, chaotic Europe would breed instability, extremism, and resentment. The same logistics that had won the war would now be used to secure the peace. Food became a weapon against radicalism. Infrastructure became a defense against Soviet expansion. Former German soldiers held in POW camps were astonished by the care they received. They were fed regularly, given medical treatment, housed in heated barracks. Some gained weight in captivity. This was not cruelty or neglect. It was the overflow of a system designed to feed millions. American logistics officers calculated that it cost less to feed POW adequately than to deal with disease, unrest, or death. So they fed them. It was ruthlessly efficient compassion. By the summer of 1945, American forces in Europe numbered over 3 million men. Sustaining them required the delivery of 45,000 tons of supplies every single day. That number had not decreased after the fighting stopped. If anything, it had grown. Occupation required as much logistics as war. Roads needed maintenance. Vehicles needed fuel. Soldiers needed rations. The system that had crossed an ocean and a continent now dug in for the long haul. And in Washington, planners were already thinking ahead. The war in the Pacific still raged. Plans were being drawn to shift resources eastward, to sustain an invasion of Japan that would require even greater logistical feats than the liberation of Europe. The factories kept running, the ships kept sailing, the trucks kept rolling, But on August 6 and August 9, 1945, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15. The war was over. And the greatest logistical machine in human history, built over 4 years at unimaginable cost, suddenly had nothing to sustain. Except it did. Because the rubble of Europe needed rebuilding, and America, which had learned to move mountains of supplies across oceans, would now use that knowledge to rebuild a shattered world. The line from Kansas to the Rhine didn't disappear. It transformed. It became the Marshall Plan. It became the Marshall Plan. It became NATO supply lines. It became the backbone of the Cold War. The trucks stopped rolling toward battle, but they never stopped rolling. The numbers, when compiled after the war, were almost incomprehensible. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States shipped over 7 million tons of supplies to Europe every month at peak capacity. That included everything: tanks, aircraft, ammunition, fuel, food, medicine, clothing, spare parts, construction materials, and items as mundane as shoelaces and soap. Over the course of the war, American forces in Europe consumed more than 21 million tons of ammunition alone. They burned through billions of gallons of fuel. They ate meals that required the harvest of entire regions. The Red Ball Express, in its 5 months of operation, moved 412,000 tons of supplies over 89 million ton-miles of road. The drivers, working shifts that defied human endurance, kept the advance alive during the most critical phase of the European campaign. Without them, Patton's Third Army would have stalled outside Paris. Montgomery's thrust into the Netherlands would have failed for lack of fuel. The liberation of France would have taken months longer, possibly years. The fuel pipelines laid across France and into Germany delivered over 1 million gallons of gasoline per day by the spring of 1945. Engineers had built over 3,000 miles of pipeline, much of it buried under roads and fields to protect it from air attack. When German forces tried to destroy sections of the pipeline, American engineers rerouted flow within hours. The system was resilient by design, redundant to the point of invulnerability. The ports told their own story. Antwerp, once it became fully operational in late 1944, processed an average of 23,000 tons of cargo per day. That single port handled more tonnage in 6 months than the entire British merchant fleet had carried in a year during the First World War. Marseille in southern France added another 10,000 tons daily. Cherbourg, rebuilt from ruins, contributed 5,000. These were not just docks and cranes. They were assembly lines for war, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week without pause. Liberty ships, those ugly utilitarian cargo vessels, made it all possible. Of the 2,700 built during the war, over 200 were lost to submarines, storms, or accidents. But the rest kept sailing. They crossed the Atlantic over 50,000 times. They delivered tanks to North Africa, supplies to Britain, ammunition to France, and food to a starving Europe. Historians would later calculate that without the Liberty ship program, the war in Europe would have lasted into 1946, possibly 1947. After the surrender, Allied intelligence officers interrogated hundreds of German military and industrial leaders. They wanted to understand how Germany had collapsed so quickly in the final year of the war. The answers were consistent. German logistics had broken down completely by late 1944. Fuel shortages crippled operations. Ammunition production couldn't keep pace with expenditure. The transportation network, bombed relentlessly by Allied air forces, ceased to function as a coherent system. Reichsminister Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, was captured in May 1945 and interrogated extensively. He was asked what Germany could have done differently. His answer was blunt. We lost the war in the factories and on the railroads, not on the battlefields. Your bombers destroyed our production, yes, but more than that. You outproduced us by a factor we could never match. We built tanks by the hundreds. You built them by the thousands. We struggled to supply one front. You supplied 2 fronts and still had surplus. It was not a war. It was arithmetic. Speer provided detailed statistics. In 1944, Germany produced 19,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. The United States produced 29,000, and that was only for the European theatre. The Pacific received thousands more. Germany manufactured 40,000 aircraft in 1944, a record year. America manufactured 96,000. Germany's entire wartime steel production was less than what American mills produced in 1943 alone. One captured German general, whose name was redacted from the interrogation report, made an observation that would haunt post-war strategic thinking. "You did not defeat us with soldiers," he said. "You defeated us with clerks and dockworkers and truck drivers. You defeated us with typewriters and shipping manifests. You defeated us with a system so vast and so efficient that we could not comprehend it until it crushed us. This was not modesty or deflection. It was recognition of a fundamental truth. The Wehrmacht had been one of the most effective fighting forces in history. German soldiers were well trained, disciplined, experienced. German tanks and aircraft were often superior in quality to their Allied counterparts. German tactics were innovative and aggressive, but none of that mattered when the supply line collapsed. By April 1945, entire German divisions were immobilized for lack of fuel. Artillery batteries fired a few shells per day, rationing ammunition that would never be replaced. Infantry units went hungry. Wounded soldiers died from infections because there was no medicine. The fighting spirit of the Wehrmacht, legendary in 1940, eroded not from lack of courage but from lack of everything else. And on the other side, American forces fought with a confidence born from certainty. They knew that if they ran out of ammunition, more would arrive within hours. They knew that if they were wounded, they would receive world-class medical care. They knew that their trucks would have fuel, their weapons would have parts, their kitchens would have food. That knowledge was worth divisions. The lessons of American logistics did not end with the war. They became doctrine. The United States military, in the years following 1945, institutionalized everything it had learned. The Defense Logistics Agency was created to centralize supply operations. The concept of just-in-time delivery, pioneered under wartime pressure, became standard practice. The use of standardized parts and modular design became non-negotiable requirements for all military equipment. NATO, formed in 1949, adopted American logistical principles as the foundation of its defense strategy. Member nations agreed to standardize ammunition, fuel, and key equipment so that forces could operate interchangeably. The idea was simple. If war came with the Soviet Union, NATO forces would need to sustain operations across a continent, just as the Allies had done against Germany. Supply would determine survival. The Korean War, which erupted in 1950, proved the value of these lessons. American forces deployed to Korea within weeks, supplied across an ocean, sustained through brutal winters and mountainous terrain. The logistics system, refined in Europe, adapted to a new theatre with remarkable speed. Troops ate hot meals. Ammunition flowed. Medical evacuation by helicopter, pioneered in Korea, saved thousands of lives and became standard procedure for all future conflicts. But the most lasting legacy of wartime logistics was not military, it was economic. The Marshall Plan, officially the European Recovery Program, launched in 1948 with an initial commitment of over $13 billion, equivalent to over $150 billion in modern currency. It was the largest aid program in history, and it worked because America knew how to move resources. The same ships that had carried tanks now carried tractors. The same ports that had unloaded ammunition now unloaded steel and machinery. The same trucks that had supplied armies now distributed food to devastated cities. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Western Europe in 4 years, faster than anyone thought possible. And it did so using the infrastructure and expertise developed during the war. European factories bombed into rubble were rebuilt with American materials. Roads and bridges destroyed by combat were repaired with American engineering support. Farms stripped by wartime requisition were restocked with American grain and livestock. The result was an economic miracle. By 1952, Western European industrial production exceeded pre-war levels, unemployment dropped. Living standards rose. Political stability returned. This was not charity, it was strategic investment. American planners understood that a prosperous Europe would be a stable Europe, resistant to Soviet influence and communism. The same logic that had fed German power now fed entire nations. Logistics became geopolitics. The Soviet Union watched all of this with a mixture of admiration and alarm. Stalin had witnessed American logistical capability firsthand through Lend-Lease, which had provided the Red Army with over 400,000 trucks, 13,000 tanks, and 15,000 aircraft during the war. Without those supplies, the Soviet Union could not have sustained its offensives after 1943. Soviet marshals privately admitted this, though public propaganda never acknowledged it. Now, in the post-war era, The Soviet Union attempted to replicate American logistics. It could not. The centralized command economy, effective at mobilizing resources for wartime production, proved inefficient at peacetime distribution. Soviet logistics remained plagued by bottlenecks, corruption, and waste. Roads were poor, trucks were scarce. The rail system, though extensive, was overburdened and outdated. Meanwhile, America continued to innovate. Containerization, the practice of shipping goods in standardized metal boxes that could be transferred from ships to trucks to trains without unpacking, was pioneered in the 1950s and revolutionized global trade. The concept came directly from wartime experience, where speed of delivery mattered more than elegance. By the 1960s, containerization had become the backbone of international commerce. Back in the United States, the veterans of the Supply Corps returned home and applied their skills to civilian life. They became executives at shipping companies, logistics managers at factories, planners for infrastructure projects. The interstate highway system, championed by President Eisenhower in 1956, was conceived partly as a defense logistics network, a way to move military supplies rapidly across the continent in the event of war. But it also became the foundation of American economic expansion, enabling the growth of suburbs, the rise of trucking, and the integration of regional markets into a national economy. The men who had driven the Red Ball Express returned to lives of quiet obscurity. Most were never honored. No monuments were built in their name. They didn't march in victory parades. James Rookard, the driver who had kept his truck rolling through exhaustion and enemy fire, went home to Philadelphia and worked as a bus driver for 30 years. He never spoke much about the war. When asked, he would say only that he did his job. But historians, decades later, would recognize what those men had accomplished. The Red Ball Express moved more supplies in 5 months than the entire Confederate Army had consumed in 4 years of the Civil War. It did so with fewer men, over longer distances, under enemy fire. The drivers, almost all of them black soldiers in a segregated army, had sustained the liberation of Europe. They had made history without recognition, and history had moved forward on the wheels they turned. By the 1960s, the phrase logistical superiority had entered the military lexicon as a defining characteristic of American power. It wasn't just about having more, it was about delivering more, faster, more reliably, across greater distances, in harsher conditions, than any potential adversary. From Vietnam to the Gulf War to Afghanistan, American forces operated with the assumption that supply would never fail. Sometimes that assumption was tested, but it was never broken. The line from Kansas to the Rhine had become permanent. It no longer carried tanks and shells. But it carried grain, medicine, machinery, technology, and ideas. It was the invisible backbone of an interconnected world, built by men who understood that victory is not won by the sword alone, but by the hand that feeds it. There is a road in Kansas, flat and straight, cutting through wheat fields that stretch to the horizon. In summer, the grain turns gold under an endless sky. The wind moves through it like water. There are no monuments here, no plaques, no statues of soldiers frozen in bronze, just the road and the fields and the quiet hum of a nation that once turned this wheat into the fuel of liberation. The war ended 80 years ago, but the echoes remain, not in battlefields, but in systems. In the way cargo ships cross oceans, in the way trucks move goods across continents, in the precision of supply chains that feed billions. The logistics revolution, born in the factories of Detroit and the ports of New York, did not end in 1945. It became the architecture of the modern world. Wars are not won by courage alone. They are won by the unglamorous mathematics of supply, by the clerks who track inventory, the welders who build ships, the drivers who push through exhaustion, the farmers who grow the grain, the engineers who lay the pipelines. These are the invisible hands that turn national will into battlefield reality. They do not seek glory. They do not expect recognition. They simply do the work, day after day, until the work is done. Germany lost the Second World War in many ways. It lost because it invaded nations it could not defeat. It lost because it fought ideologies it could not destroy. But beneath all of that, it lost because it could not feed its armies. It could not fuel its tanks. It could not replace what was destroyed. And on the other side stood an enemy that could do all of those things endlessly, without hesitation, without limit. The line from Kansas to the Rhine was never just about distance. It was about will. The will to organize, the will to produce, the will to deliver. It was the will of a democratic nation that chose, in its moment of crisis, not to conquer but to sustain, to feed not just its own soldiers, but the soldiers of its allies, to rebuild not just its own cities, but the cities of its enemies. That will, forged in the fire of total war, became the foundation of a new order. It was not perfect. It was not without cost. But it was effective. And in the end, effectiveness is what history remembers. Somewhere in the archives there is a photograph of an American truck driver, helmet tilted back, cigarette dangling from his lips, leaning against the hood of his GMC Jimmy. Behind him, the road stretches into the distance. He is exhausted. He is exhausted. He is anonymous. He is essential. And he is going forward, because forward is the only direction the supply line moves. The wheat still grows in Kansas. The Rhine still flows through Germany. And the road between them, invisible now, but remains the quiet testament to a truth as old as war itself. Empires rise and fall, but the hands that feed them endure.